All right, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So Speedham Leith is Iowa State University's 15th president. He assumed leadership of the university on January 16, 2012. Trained as a plant scientist, Leith has served at 3 universities in teaching, research, and economic development posts en route to the ISU presidency. In his most recent previous post, Leith was vice president for research and sponsored programs for the 16-campus University of North Carolina system, where he made a significant impact on a number of external research grants and contracts for the institution and improved technology transfer activities. At North Carolina State University, Raleigh, Leith held several positions, including Director of the North Carolina Agricultural Research Service, ARS, Associate Dean of the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, Professor and Research Leader and Plant Pathologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, ARS. Leith began his academic career at the University of Illinois, Urbana, and as an extension plant pathologist. President Leith has published numerous articles on plant disease, resistance, plant breeding, and related areas, and has presented his scientific work through the U.S. and in numerous countries. We are very fortunate to have him as our newest president and excited that he has taken the time to become familiar and join us at iScore this year. Please join me in welcoming President Stephen Leith.
Thank you and good morning. I'm delighted to be here. This is an exciting opportunity for me to welcome all of you to Iowa State University's Conference on Race and Ethnicity, or iScore as we know it. You know, one of the great things about being new to Iowa State is I get to experience a lot of things new, and they're all exciting to me, they're fresh for me, and this is one of those events, one of those opportunities that I was looking forward to. This may be your 13th one, but I want you to think about it from a perspective of someone who's excited to be here for the first time. And one of those people is me. I knew before I came here this was a big deal and a great program. My senior leadership made it real clear to me, especially Dr. Hill. Matter of fact, he talked to me before I even took the job to make sure this would be on my calendar, and I knew that's how important it was to the culture of Iowa State University. This is something that needed to be a priority for me. So I want to thank everyone that's been involved in this program, especially Dr. Hill, who we've had great conversations about this, and he's probably been the strongest advocate from what I can tell and what I hear around campus. So thank you, Tom. I also want to thank the student affairs folks like Japana Kellogg here in the front, who spends many hours with the students, both to go to NCORE and making sure those that plan and carry out iScore can do it well. Without all of you working on this program would not be successful. I think sometimes people look at a big university and think about the administrators like Tom and I, but Tom and I know that it's other folks that carry these things on and really make them successful. It's a type of enthusiasm and dedication and focus on programs that make them successful. So again, thank you. I'm very impressed that I learned more than 200 students have participated in our national program, NCORE, over the last 13 years. And even more impressed that apparently 4,000 of you have participated in iScore since the program began. Congratulations on putting this together for the community and for making the university a better place. And I'm going to talk a little more specifically about some other things we need to do to continue to make this a better place. But before I do that, I want to finish some thank yous. I want to thank people like Professor Nana Osei Kofi of the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and longtime Ames resident Grace Amamaya, whose late husband was a faculty member here for many years and is going to be one of our speakers today. There's also another recognition I'd like to make, and that's to a member of our faculty who's contributed so much to the success of iScore over the years. You see the images as you came in today. They're beautiful, and they effectively represented iScore for the last 13 years, including this year's conference art, where I'm honored to be part of it with former President Greg Joffrey. I'd like to ask Professor Brenda Jones to come forward for a moment. When she does, let's give her a hand. That's okay. You don't need to explain it. I want to announce with Brenda up front so you can all see her that starting now, because she's made this program such a tremendous success with her contributions, that we've established the Brenda Jones N-Score, I-Score Change Agent Award in your honor. And I'm going to tell you that Japana has worked tremendously with this program over the years, and he has the high honor of describing this award in detail, and he'll be up here in a moment to do that. So he'll come up here and describe it in detail for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Folks, I'm very proud to be the 15th president of Iowa State. This is a great land-grant university, and I'm a firm believer in land-grant universities and land-grant mission. Many of you know I went to school at 3 land grants, spent most of my career, 20 years, on the campus of another land grant. A big part of the land-grant mission to me is access, and that's just not access from an academic standpoint. That's access for all people, and I think we really need to think about that and focus on that. Land grants have had a great record of opening doors for people. People like George Washington Carver, who clearly is known here, but he's a legend through the South, where I've spent the last 25 years. He's really known across the world. But even in the case of George Washington Carver, he was at the time more of an exception than the rule. And over the past 150 years, we've made tremendous progress, but we're not where we really need to be. There are still young people being denied access at places. There's other obstacles to their passive opportunity forward. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about and focusing on, and how we can fix things. These obstacles can be because of race or gender, or sometimes for reasons I don't even understand. And we all know that to some extent that continues today. Sometimes it's more subtle. A clear example of that were the racist postings we saw earlier in the Iowa State Daily column, and we also saw it on a Facebook page. I thought it was important to address that here because many of us know this has occurred. I don't want to infringe on anyone's individual rights of free speech or freedom of expression, but nevertheless, I think at an institution like this, if we're going to be successful and move forward, we've got to do something to move away from that divisive behavior. So we will do what we can. We have suggested strongly that the Iowa State Daily remove that Just Saying column from their publication, and they have. And I think, I won't know if I'm pleased, but I'm relieved that they did the right thing. There's also an effort through our university attorney to take our trademarks, our Iowa State logos, off websites where they don't belong, where we don't want to be associated. And we don't want to be associated with despicable comments and things like we saw recently. So we moved aggressively in those areas. There was a forum yesterday. There'll be another one at the end of this conference. Our goal is to create opportunities for faculty, staff, students to find effective ways to mitigate this and move forward and change what I think most of us hoped we were past, but clearly, we still have some issues to resolve. So my goal here, and I think the goal of I-Score, is to make true access the rule, not an exception, remove all these problems that we unfortunately keep saying, and really move diversity forward at Iowa State University. I was really proud of the many things I'd seen done here before I came and since I've been here. But I can see our work isn't done. We're going to continue to move forward. And everybody here at Iowa State not only has my support, they have a passion for this from me. I-Score is going to be very important in this process, make no doubt about it, because through I-Score we gain ideas, we gain excitement, enthusiasm. These 4,000 members I talked about before, there's an army of dedicated people that are going to work diligently to move this forward. This isn't a one-person show. This is going to take a lot of cooperative effort to get where we want to go. I'm very proud of the history of the university, the active leadership many of you have taken, what we've done to move forward through a difficult time and continue to move forward. And I want to thank everyone who's part of this program for what they do. And I'm really, really pleased to be at my first one. And you can consider that 4,000 number 4,001 now. So thank you.
Let's give President Leith another round of applause. This truly is a family event, and at this moment I want to welcome you to the family. We got your own copy, so I don't think you plan on carrying it back to your office, so we can deliver it. But as I said, this is a very, very special time. I think the students, the staff, the faculty, I think they look forward to being here, and hopefully the fellowship continues. I'm going to say a couple more words about Brenda Jones, and the award is here. And it reads, Iowa State's Conference on Race and Ethnicity, Brenda Jones, in recognition of your dedication and service, 2002. The screening committee, or not the screening committee, the planning committee and I were thinking about how we can show our appreciation. And we thought, if it was up to me, we'd just give you an award every year, But I think knowing you, you'd probably duck out back and you wouldn't want us to make that big of a fuss about you. So as we put our heads together, we thought about, it's time. So from this day forward, what we want to do is it'll be the Brenda Jones NCORE ICE-CORE Change Agent Award. The award will be presented to an ICE-CORE NCORE alum who continues to demonstrate change agent characteristics, demonstrating personal growth related to understanding issues and topics related to race and ethnicity, contributes to the awareness of issues and topics related to race and ethnicity among their peers, and passionately uses their talents and competencies to create change on campus and in their community. And I think this exemplifies what I've witnessed. She's taken trips with us to the national conference. We've sat in the circle. We've talked. We've sat in the circle and sat on our hands, and she's come in the room and turned it upside down. So it's, personally witnessing that, this is my honor to present this to you.
Okay. You don't get me often, but this got me tonight. And it got me this morning, it got me yesterday, it got me forever, because I grew to love this university. And it wasn't easy. I look around this room now, and it has diversity. But when I started, it was no diversity. It was me, Dr. Jackson, and then Carla Tartikoff, and then we had a bomb. We had you guys. Dr. Hill, God, I'm proud of this. My father, who's Douglas, would be dancing because he truly believed in education. He believed that was the only way out. I had a point for you guys, but I forgot my speech. I'm very lucky on that. But what I wanted to tell each one of you, this is for the students, you don't give up. You never give in. You fight for what's right. That's right. Integrity, justice for all. That's right. Because if one is left behind, we're all left behind. That's right. All right. And you're right. I do like to be in the back. Because I think you have to give. And you have to give from your heart. You have to give willingly. Thank every one of you. I will cherish this. And you know I don't try to, but you got me this time.
All right, so our second speaker today is Nana Osei Kofi. Nana Osei Kofi is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Iowa State University, where she directs the Social Justice Studies Certificate Program. Osei Kofi received her PhD from Claremont Graduate University and taught at UCLA, Pomona College, and Texas Tech University prior to her appointment at Iowa State. Osei Kofi's research in the areas of cultural studies in education, critical and feminist theories of education, the politics of higher education, and arts-based inquiry. Some of the journals in which her work has appeared include the Equity and Excellence in Education, the Review of Higher Education, the Journal of Higher Education, and Discourse Studies of the Cultural Politics of Education. Osei Kofi currently serves on the editorial advisory board of Feminist Foundations and has previously served on the editorial board of the Review of Higher Education. She is also a former associate editor for the National Women's Studies Association Journal. Osei Kofi has held leadership positions in the American Educational Research Association, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, the National Women's Studies Association. She is also a 2006 Future of Minority Studies Mellon Fellow. As an agent of change, Osei Kofi is deeply committed to the production of transdisciplinary knowledge that challenges discipline-oriented boundaries in order to gain new insights in service of social transformation and to the creation of learning environments that make it possible for students to gain the intellectual skills and practical knowledge necessary to collectively shape the world in which we live. Please join me in welcoming Nana Osei Kofi.
Thank you very much. All right, so I just want to start with having a little bit of an idea who's in the room. It's always nice to have a little bit of sense of who you're speaking to, and I do see a number of students that I know, so thank you for being here. But I'm curious, in addition to President Leith, how many of you are actually here for the first time? Okay, wow, wonderful, wonderful. So how many people then have been here once or more, just to get a little bit of a sense? Oh, excellent, excellent. 2 hands? That's fantastic. I mean, as you heard, we have 700 people registered for this conference, and my hope is really that the more people that we have come to these events each year, the more work we get done, right? And so the more we're able to do work that achieves the vision of NCORE and ICECORE, so that's incredibly important and exciting. So you know that this stuff is hard work, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm going to spend some time talking about. And I think President Leith's comments very much addressed that hard work, and I really want to applaud President Leith for head-on addressing some of the issues that we need to deal with. I think that is extremely important in this work. So wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that. Okay, so let's see, we got technology, we got all that set. So one of the things that I was asked to talk a little bit about before I started making my remarks was how I come to this work. So why is race and ethnicity important to me? Why do these issues matter? Why do I do this work? My family history is really what brings me to this work. So this is a picture of me with my parents. My father was born and grew up in Ghana in West Africa. Ghana was a British colony until 1957. And then he was an international student in the United Kingdom in the 1960s, which is where he met my mother, who was also an international student there, visiting from Sweden. My mother was somebody that came from a family of labor organizers. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, my grandmother, who was a special education teacher, in addition to doing labor organizing work, was also somebody who worked with Swedish educators in support of African independence struggles. So actually, for me growing up, part of what I remember most about her work is being involved with ANC, the African National Congress, that fought against, of course, apartheid in South Africa. So my parents met, fast forward. They settled in Sweden, where my father received a PhD in sociology from Gothenburg University in 1974. My mother worked as a language arts teacher, primarily teaching German and English. So my father was part of one of the first groups of African students to study at Gothenburg University. So between his friends from graduate school, which were very much concerned with the legacy of colonialism in Africa and the future of the African continent, and my maternal grandmother's friends and colleagues who were involved with labor organizing and African solidarity struggles, my childhood is very much filled with memories of people having very, very heated political discussions in our home, and being also taken to organizing meetings of different kinds and sort of just sitting in the back and observing. Now, of course, I didn't fully understand what was going on or what those discussions were about, but I think that I did recognize that whatever was at stake was serious, and it was something that the people that were involved with it were extremely passionate about. So I grew up in Ghana and Sweden, so my experience growing up included being one of few people of color in predominantly white spaces, as well as being a person of color in predominantly black spaces. Now, even though Sweden is predominantly white and was much more so 40 plus years ago, our day-to-day lives very much happened in diverse spaces. So actually, it wasn't until we moved to Ghana, which was around the time when I started school, that I began to have some sense of what this idea of difference meant. And for me, that actually happened with kids. It always happens with kids, right? But it happened with kids that actually teased me for being Brony. So I don't know if there's anybody in here that speaks Twi, but okay. So you know what I mean. So essentially, roughly, I mean, translating to being white. So Twi is a language that's spoken in the Ashanti region in Ghana, and we lived in Kumasi. So I mention all this as a way of introduction to say that I've been thinking deeply about and been involved with issues of social and economic justice from the beginning. As an individual, I identify with struggles of all forms of oppression around the world. Issues related to race, class, gender, sexuality, immigration status, globalization, the environment. These are all some of the key social justice issues of our times. And for me, I want to say that these are not matters that I engage with for the sake of simply academic discourse, right, or an academic exercise. These are about real people, they're about real lives, and they're also about real consequences. I believe it's about my life, and I would suggest that it's about yours as well. So for me, this is really about being able to learn from the past, to engage with the present, and think about how we do this work around shaping the future. So as I thought about what I was going to say today and what was possible in 30 minutes, I looked closely at the work that's been done by the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in American Higher Education, or NCORE, which this conference is based on. And what was the most significant to me was the conference focus, and I'll read that to you. It's described as focusing on the complex task of creating and sustaining comprehensive institutional change designed to improve racial and ethnic relations on campus and to expand opportunities for educational access and success by culturally diverse, traditionally underrepresented populations. So with this in mind, I want to speak to some broad key issues that I think are critical to advancing informed anti-racist, anti-prejudice discussion. And that's the type of discussion that I think is essential to instituting and sustaining the type of comprehensive change that both NCORE and ISCORE seek to advance. Too often, I want to suggest that we're caught up with quick fixes and what we think are easy solutions. So 10 steps to losing 10 pounds in a week doesn't work. 10 steps to eliminating racism in 10 days, 10 weeks, 10 months, it does not work either. Only by being willing to engage with complexity and being willing to abandon individualistic Band-Aid approaches to justice and equity can we begin to create lasting, far-reaching, comprehensive structural and cultural changes that are necessary to challenge the realities of oppression in its many varied forms. In fact, I would suggest that if we're doing the work that needs to be done at events such as this, we should have tangible evidence of how we as an institution have done our work, how we've shifted, how we've made changes in the areas that we choose to place emphasis on in relation to creating more just and equitable policies and practices. So to that, Chris Fowler, Johanna Kellogg, that you met earlier, and Stephanie Zawicki, have a session at the end of the day, if you look at the program, that looked at the 13-year history of this conference. And I want to suggest that that may be a good place to think deeply about where we've been and where we're going. There's also an earlier session in the morning that's being led by Don Bratt Prince, John Taylor, and Karen Zunkel, which looks at the ISU plan for equity, diversity, and community and how we move forward in 2012 and beyond. So I think that's also a good place to engage with questions of where we've been and where we're going with our work on racial and ethnic justice, as well as other forms of justice, of course. So when I think of events like this, I believe our focus should be on working ourselves out of a job. Okay? So this doesn't mean that this is going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen the day after. And yes, we have multiple issues to engage. And yes, we will be doing this work for a long time. But what I'm suggesting is that our mindset needs to be one of eliminating racism, eliminating ethnic prejudice, eliminating other forms of injustice, rather than simply educating about it. Okay, so it's about an intentionality in our mindset when we think about how we approach these issues. So the things I want to share with you today, I think, are things that I hope you'll consider as you spend the day in these different panel presentations that all deal with race and ethnicity in some form. I also want to spend a little bit of time in the end localizing the conversation to higher education, since that's the focus of the conference. And I want to speak a little bit to the ways that we as a social institution have traditionally engaged with matters of diversity as a way to help us all think about the future and how we might advance an agenda of racial and ethnic justice. Because the time is so short and these are such large and important issues, I'm going to be very intentional about naming some key thinkers and some key ideas on the subject matter, and I hope that you might find a few things to jot down, maybe a little reading list. I know my students laughed when I mentioned that, but something that you might want to look up later, so that as a way of extending this conversation so that it doesn't stop here. Some of what I have to say may unsettle you. In fact, I may already have unsettled you, because I believe it's impossible to talk about justice and equity without looking deeply within ourselves, deeply examining our lives, and that can be unsettling. In fact, Audre Lorde urges each one of us to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside ourselves and touch the terror and loathing of any difference that lives there. See whose face it wears, she says. Then, she suggests, that personal as political can begin to illuminate all our choices. To muster the courage to think critically for ourselves must sit at the center of education, and after all, that is what we should be about in this space. So to begin, I want to say something about framing, context, and action. So how we frame the issues at hand, what we believe the context to be, and how we approach that action. So let me start with how we frame the issue of race and ethnicity and say something about the language of race, racialization, and racism. So if you read my work, you'll notice that I use the language of racialization a lot. So why do I do that? And what does that mean? I do that because we know that race is a social construction and not biology. In fact, well recognized by scholars. But race is essentially treated as real in American society and too often in scholarship. Now, let me be very clear. Race as a social construction, of course, is not to say that the idea of race does not have real material consequences. Of course it does. But to talk about racialization signifies the act of constructing individuals and groups hierarchically in relation to power and privilege based on visual and cultural markers. So to talk about racialization is what Jill Olomida has described as placing the burden of race thinking at the feet of the race thinker. The larger idea here is that no matter the intention, if we don't shift to conversations about racialization and racism, we're working in partnership with the ideology of race, which exists to categorize hierarchically. So part of understanding racialization, part of what it does, it allows us to see how the meaning of race shifts in different contexts. So, for example, when I was talking earlier about my experience in Ghana, contrast that to when I was a teenager and in Sweden at the time. It was the time when Roots, which is the television series based on Alex Haley's work, famous work, was one of the most popular television shows. So what that meant for me was that I had kids that would see me and look at me and point and say, Kunta Kinte. Okay? Now, that's what Stuart Hall describes as race as a floating signifier. Right? So we have two settings, we have different, same person, we have different meanings and different ways of racializing. Now, of course, these examples that I provide are examples on the personal level, and while I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't focus on that, fundamentally I do believe it's systemic and institutional forms of injustice that have to be our focus in anti-racist struggles if we're to achieve the ideals of liberty and justice for all. So what's important is to look at how we racialize large groups of people and how this, whether consciously or not, shapes our policies and day-to-day practices within society. The poet, scholar, and educator June Jordan said that there's difference and there's power, and who holds power decides the meaning of difference. And I think that captures what we must look at when we think about how racialization occurs and how we fight against racism and fundamentally against the ideology of race. So in thinking about racialization, I do also want to point your attention to Troy Duster's work as well as Michael Olmey's work on the recent ways in which especially the pharmaceutical industry is relinking race and biology in highly problematic ways with the idea of ethnic designer drugs. Duster has done extensive and impressive work in this area. And just as a snippet, there's a comment that's always stayed with me, and it has to do with, he talks about African Americans and hypertension, and African Americans having a higher rate of hypertension than other groups in society. And so what he says is, if you follow me around Nordstrom, if you put me in jail at 9 times the rate of whites, if you refuse to give me a bank loan, I might get hypertensive. What's generating my increased blood pressure are social forces at play, not my DNA. Okay? So framing is important. And also, so with this in the program today, Michael Benitez has a session on racialization. So if that's something that you want to explore further, that may be of interest to you. So I also want to propose that understanding intersectionality is an important part of how we frame the realities that we seek to change. Many times people feel like they have to choose among the multiple identities that we've come up with as society, whether that has to do with how they identify personally or how they approach working for social change. So often issues will be framed as issues of race or issues of gender or issues of class or issues of sexuality, but rarely do we see sufficient engagement with the ways in which these categories of analysis intersect. To quote Audre Lorde, there are no single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. Yet often our work seems to point to a belief that we do. So when I teach intersectionality, one of the texts that I use is Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. It's a short story, a poem. Some of you may be familiar with it. But what we do is we talk about the work, and then students do some writing on how intersectionality has impacted and shaped their own lives. And I can remember a student specifically sharing with the class that up until that point, she'd really only thought about her racialized identity. But as she was looking at doing this work and looking at her high school experience, and this happened for her to be in some of her science classes, she recognized that it wasn't just about her racialized identity, but it was the fact that she was a woman of color, so it also had something to do with her gender. Now, for those of you that do work in intersectionality, I do want to acknowledge that there's a fair amount of complexity and different perspectives on intersectionality as far as the theoretical debate goes, but I did want to introduce the idea here to suggest that single-issue approaches remain dominant in the work that we do for social change. And when that happens, what I believe is that critical elements of injustice are made invisible. And so also with these single-issue approaches, the responses that we have are often to the symptoms of injustice rather than root causes. And I'm suggesting then that this is a function of what becomes invisible. My second point has to do with context, the context in which we find ourselves and how we think about it. And the most sort of direct way that I can say that is that just because President Barack Obama is president, it does not mean that we live in a post-racial or a colorblind society, okay? There are many ways I can make this point, but let me also suggest that if this was true, it would mean that the type of data that you see in front of you would just be a result of chance, okay? So I'm going to share a story about colorblind society and sort of these post-racial ideas. So a colleague of mine, this is something she shared a couple of weeks ago, she was on a flight. And so she got on the plane, started putting her luggage up at top, and a flight attendant very quickly approached her and said, "Ma'am, you can't put your bags there." "Okay, where do you want me to put my bags?" "Let me see your ticket." She gives the woman her ticket, and very quickly the flight attendant's face turns bright red. Okay? "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize this was your seat." My colleague, who's also an education scholar, had a seat in first class. Okay? So race was never mentioned, but was at play, as the assumption was that a woman of color did not belong in first class. Okay? So let me suggest that just because race and ethnicity is not invoked, or we're not talking about people being victims of racial or ethnic slurs, although of course that's still with us, and President Leith spoke about that, and we also know what's happened nationally with Jeremy Lin. I mean, there are lots of examples of that. But even when that is not the case, we do not live in a colorblind society. In fact, I would suggest that the more fearful we are about talking about race and ethnicity, the more it allows racism and ethnic prejudice to develop and to grow. Colorblindness denies that social concepts of race structure our perceptions, shape our attitudes, and influence our individual, collective, and institutional practices. Moreover, when ideas of colorblindness and post-raciality are accompanied by a notion of niceness at all costs as a dominant communication style, we face an additional issue. What this creates are situations where those who raise concerns about racism and ethnic prejudice become the problem. Okay? They become the problem because in raising the issues, they're violating the code of niceness at all costs and seen as being divisive, rather than racism and prejudice being the main problems. So what this is saying is that we expect diversity to fit into the dominant norm. So how we understand, right, how we contextualize and how we frame issues of diversity and equity are extremely important. Finally, I want to say something about action and taking action, how we work for change. So we're located at a PWI. Those of you that study higher education know that PWI stands for predominantly white institution. We're also in a predominantly white state. So I want to say something about white privilege and what it means to do ally work. So white privilege is a term you've probably heard, and of course many of you know that the state of Iowa was home to the White Privilege Conference for many years. Many of you will also be familiar with Peggy McIntosh's classic work on unpacking the invisible knapsack. I'm sure that all our ICE Corps participants have been exposed to that work. So for those of you who are not familiar with that work, McIntosh was somebody that had done a lot of work on gender and equity and was very familiar with and recognized unearned male privilege. However, as a white woman, it took her a longer time to engage with her unearned privilege as a result of skin color. And so that's what this article is about. And so basically what she does, really the core of her work, is a list of the daily aspects of white privilege that she comes to realize. So some of the examples of the things that she says are, I'm never asked to speak for all people of my racial group. I'm pretty much sure that if I asked to talk to the person in charge, I'll be facing a person of my race. And I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. So those are just a few examples of this idea of white privilege in the day-to-day. So what do we do with white privilege? What do we do with male privilege? What do we do with heterosexual privilege as part of working for greater equity? What Sus Leonardo reminds us is that privileges are symptoms and not causes. So therefore we must first make sure to not mistake the two, right? So not mistake symptoms for causes. To understand and to change the causes of unearned privilege, we have to interrogate both historical and contemporary practices and relations that keep privileges intact. Now, on the immediate and the individual level, part of what we need to do in all instances of privilege, I want to suggest, is to acknowledge it. Okay? So many of you have probably heard Tim Wise speak before, and one of the things that I've always appreciated about his work, he does a lot of speaking on college campuses, is that one of the first things he does is he acknowledges the fact that nothing he's about to say about race, about racism, about white privilege, about people of color, what have you, is new. It's been said by people of color before. Okay? But he recognizes and he addresses the fact that because he looks like what we expect an expert to look like, he gets invited to over 100 campuses a year to do this work. So in his acknowledgement of that, what he does for the audience is that he forces the audience to look critically at our own assumptions and to ask that question of who do we listen to and why is it that we listen to that person? Okay. So for me, I want to suggest that to have unearned privilege and to recognize it is the beginning of doing important ally work. And in fact, some of you might have been at a session a couple of weeks ago here on campus. Monica Adams was one of the speakers, and she gave a wonderful speech that spoke in many ways to what it means to be an ally. And I think one of the most important things that she said in her speech was that movements for social justice need to be led by those most deeply affected by injustice. This means that the movement for racial and ethnic justice must be led by people of color. Work against poverty must be led by the poor, and so on. Now, let me be clear. This does not mean that because somebody's part of a minoritized group, they automatically have some correct analysis of injustice. Nor does it mean that the movement does not need allies in support of that leadership, because they do. What it means, though, is that critical analysis must begin from the objective experiences of those most affected in order to understand the dynamics of structural power relations, and that from that analysis, it must then be up to those who are mostly affected to decide on what changes should look like. Because however well-intentioned, to have someone else decide for you is not liberating in any way, shape, or form. To be an ally also requires that we do our own work in relation to the issues or to the movements that we want to support. As allies, no matter what the issues are, it's our responsibility to do our own work of self-reflexivity. This is not the responsibility of those affected. So a good colleague of mine, Paul Gorski, addressed the challenge of this a number of years ago, speaking of his failure as a multicultural educator to introspectively examine the multicultural issues he taught to students. So here's what he wrote in an article about this. He said, "This is the ultimate luxury of whiteness, the ability to see myself as neutral and thus excuse myself from any responsibility for addressing racial issues in education, society in general, and most importantly, myself. Even as an educator of multicultural education courses and workshops, I was able to avoid addressing my own issues by assuming either the role of advocate or the role of cultural theorist. So we must all do our work understanding how we're situated in society, how that informs our worldview, and ask ourselves hard questions about whether what we've come to believe and the ways in which we show up in the world truly foster inclusivity, or whether we're maintaining the status quo." So those are the issues of framing context and action, and I hope that you'll keep those in mind throughout the day. Now, as I promised, we're focused on higher education, so let me say a little bit about that. So I want to speak really briefly to three things that I think we can address as a way of positively shifting traditional higher education discourse as a way to then impact change. And what's really important about this is there's absolutely nothing new I'm going to say. Zero. There's absolutely nothing new that I'm going to say. But these are issues that we continue to struggle with as in making these changes, and so as long as that's the case, you get to hear me talk about these things. Foods and festivals' approach to diversity. Some people also talk about this as food festivals and heroes, food fabric and festivals, approach to diversity. These continue to play a prominent role in institutions of higher education as a way to respond to the need to be more inclusive, and I want to suggest that this is an issue. The foods and festivals approach is very much a cultural tourism approach. It seeks to celebrate differences in things like food, clothes, music, cultural artifacts of those who are seen as being different from the norm. And what I want to suggest is that when we do that, we objectify and we homogenize the other, while at the same time making invisible those differences that I think that we actually need to talk about and that actually need to be eradicated. So being willing to engage with differences in power, with differences in access, with differences in privilege. And not only a lot of times are these events don't have a lot of depth when we think about the cultural awareness piece. They teach the university community to see anyone that's different from what is understood as the norm as the other. And the important piece, or the take-home message about this, is that this approach does not have any ability to address racism or sexism or homophobia or classism or any other ism for that matter. Certainly, there is a place for food and culture, but it's not the answer to authentically creating more inclusive campus environments. My second point is tied to the first one, in that we place such an emphasis on the other that we never examine the norm. So when we focus on tolerating, on managing, or celebrating diversity, or even individual level prejudice reduction work, we're failing to look at what we take for granted in relation to race and class, gender, sexuality. And this keeps the discourse at an individual level rather than a systemic level, which is necessary if we're interested in long-term sustainable change. Dolores Delgado Benal, Octavia Villapondo, Tara Yoso, Andrea Smith are some excellent scholars that have looked at this work and can help us think through that. So if that's something you're interested in, I would just encourage you to look at their work. Finally, I want to point to the danger of an overemphasis on numbers when it comes to diversity. So, point of clarification, I did not say that numbers are not important. So I don't want anybody to leave here and say that, she said numbers weren't important, okay? Numbers are important. But numbers can easily become a shield against the need to engage with the underlying culture that marginalizes members of non-dominant groups. It's very easy to have a lot of people of color and women and still marginalize these groups. We certainly have a lot of examples from world history. So the point is that numbers are one indicator, but that alone is not enough. Some of the work that I find particularly useful in thinking through this is Daryl Smith's work in terms of this relationship of numbers to culture. So, for example, by focusing on undergraduate enrollment when assessing levels of diversity, campuses many times claim high levels of diversity. But what Smith shows using national data is how diversity disappears the higher up you look in the hierarchy. She uses the analogy of the miner's canary to suggest that how diverse populations are doing in institutions provides an indication of the health of the overall institution. And in making this suggestion, she notes that most campuses in the United States have too much homogeneity in decision-making in order to build human capacity. And human capacity is something that she talks about as essential to institutional capacity building for diversity. So this is only one aspect of these issues in terms of that relationship. Katie Bruna does have a session later today that looks at this, so I would encourage you to attend that. So, in closing, if you've heard me speak before, you probably know that I rarely give a speech without mentioning the late Manning Marable, who's somebody that left us way too soon. And I typically speak to a suggestion that we must all struggle where we are. So we must all struggle where we are. There's a lot of work that's been done before us, and there's a lot that remains to be done. So we can all begin in our everyday, and I do mean all of us, with a consciousness of how we show up in the world, how our actions impact others, how the assumptions that inform our practices either help or hinder racial and ethnic justice. We can begin with a consciousness of how the reality of race and ethnicity are linked to realities of gender, sexuality, and class. And we can commit to taking tangible actions in our work to create and sustain comprehensive institutional change. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing those, inspirational. I feel like I should be in class. Honestly, I do. Thanks for sharing. We have a small token of appreciation, and we're a little bit behind schedule. So the students are going to run to prepare for their 10 o'clock session, and we're a family. We know where everything is. So find your session briefly or quickly so that we can move forward.